immediately contesting the center and opening diagonals for bishop development, sets a solid foundation. Developing a knight towards the center, immediately contesting white's central pawn with flexible piece play. Solidifying the center and preparing for queen's pawn development, white calmly develops a knight to a natural square, aiming for central influence. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to unleash a formidable bishop along the long diagonal, potentially creating significant pressure on white's queenside. Solidifying the center while preparing to deploy pieces and potentially create an overhang on the queenside for future pressure. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal immediately pressures white's center and prepares for kingside castling. Building a solid pawn chain, white prepares to fianchetto their bishop, aiming for long-term central influence. Secure king development now frees up pieces for central engagement, preparing for potential pawn breaks. Solidifying the pawn chain, this bishop now eyes the long diagonal, preparing for central expansion and potential kingside pressure. Solidifying the pawn structure, black prepares to unleash the bishop's diagonal power. Anchoring the center, the knight assumes a solid post, preparing to contest key central squares and potentially swing to the kingside for attack. Embracing the center with this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's spatial advantage and injects dynamic complexity, potentially leading to an isolated pawn for either side, shaping the ensuing middle-game struggle around central pawn structure and piece activity. Striking the center with this pawn capture immediately opens up the position, creating diagonal tensions that both players must navigate carefully. White concedes central pawn presence for greater control of the d-file and a potential outpost on e4. Accepting the central pawn exchange firmly establishes black's foothold, creating a symmetrical pawn structure that promises solid defense and future pawn breaks, while also demanding careful attention to piece development for both sides in the ensuing midfield struggle. Asserting central dominance, this knight leaps forward, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially fork pieces if black isn't careful. The knight's forward placement creates an immediate tension, forcing black to consider its disposition, which might lead to pawn structure concessions or an awkward piece retreat, all while subtly probing for weaknesses in white's own kingside. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge white's knight advance, this move subtly opens a diagonal for the queen and offers a pawn on e6 if white chooses to be aggressive, potentially leading to a more dynamic pawn structure. Fortifying the king's safety now prioritizes the nascent queenside attack, preparing for the looming central pawn pushes and potentially unlocking the file. Boldly repositioning the knight to a more active square, this maneuver prepares to challenge white's central pawn chain and potentially disrupt their queenside control, opening up possibilities for further piece development and counterplay on the queenside. Seizing central initiative becomes paramount here, as f4 aims to solidify control over the d5 square and prepare for potential pawn pushes like e4, seeking to crack open black's king's Indian setup and gain space for white's pieces. Exchanging the knight opens a diagonal for the queen and eases the pressure on the e6 pawn, but it surrenders the excellent outpost for the black knight on d7, potentially allowing white's pieces to penetrate the queenside more effectively. Liberating the e-file for a rook now opens up attacking possibilities, but it also creates a potential weakness on the e5 square, so vigilance regarding black's knight maneuvering is crucial. Black boldly repositions the knight to attack the center, creating a dynamic battleground where piece activity will soon outweigh pawn structure. Opening the center is a double-edged sword, instantly creating dynamic possibilities, but also potentially exposing king safety. The pawn sacrifice initiates a fascinating strategic battle for central influence, forcing white's pieces to commit defensively and potentially creating dynamic counterplay on the e-file for black's knight. Strategically consolidating the queenside pawn structure and preparing to activate the bishop along the long diagonal, this maneuver aims to secure piece mobility and potentially initiate a kingside assault later. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside after castling signals a bold attempt to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces, though it creates immediate weaknesses around the king. A crucial pawn structure change is initiated, opening the e-file for potential queen or rook infiltration, while simultaneously liberating white's knight on f3 to potentially participate in further central operations. This capture sacrifices the pawn's immediate structural integrity on the king side, but aims to exploit the resulting openness and black's slightly hampered development of its kingside pieces, which might now find themselves defending rather than attacking. The rook now becomes an active participant, eyeing the open f-file and bringing its considerable power to bear on white's kingside pawn structure, creating immediate tactical possibilities and putting pressure on white's central pawn majority. The knight's bold leap to e4 opens a vital central file for white's rook, preparing to exert pressure on the d-file and potentially targeting black's undeveloped queenside. Instigating a rook exchange here, black seeks to simplify the position, potentially relieving pressure on the e-file and opening up avenues for his remaining pieces. Reclaiming the queen, white solidifies central control and eyes the now exposed black king. This queen maneuver aims to exploit the lingering weaknesses around black's monarch, potentially initiating a swift attack or consolidating a positional advantage by tying down black's pieces defensively. The exchange of queens, while removing immediate tactical fireworks, shifts the game towards a more strategic battle where white's development advantage can be leveraged. Black's knight embarks on a daring raid towards white's king, aiming to disrupt the central harmony and exploit the open lines now available, creating immediate tactical complications. Reclaiming the open file is paramount. The rook now directly challenges the isolated knight and prepares to dominate the d-file, forcing black to consider their defensive setup very carefully. A daring gambit is launched, sacrificing pawn structure for a fierce central incursion and challenging the knight's forward march. This decision hinges on whether black can exploit the temporarily weakened kingside or if white's imposing central presence will ultimately suffocate the position. Unlocking the kingside attack with a bold knight maneuver, white aims to exploit the now exposed dark squares around black's monarch, particularly targeting the g7 bishop's weakened diagonal and potentially creating mating threats with further piece development.